For a time, the crossbow stood at the center of military innovation and medieval warfare. It was feared for its power, valued for its simplicity, and respected for its ability to challenge the dominance of heavily armored knights. Its presence on the battlefield disrupted long-standing traditions and reshaped the balance between elite warriors and common soldiers. Yet despite its early success and deadly reputation, the crossbow eventually faded from use. Understanding why this weapon, once considered revolutionary, disappeared from military strategy requires looking closely at how warfare, technology, and society evolved during the later Middle Ages. The answer lies not in a single turning point, but in a combination of practical, tactical, and economic factors that gradually pushed the crossbow into the background as new weapons and methods of combat took its place. Number 1, from revolutionary to controversial. When the crossbow first entered the scene in medieval Europe, it immediately changed how people thought about warfare. Before its arrival, combat heavily favored those who had the time, money, and resources to train with traditional weapons like the sword or the longbow. Mastering those tools took years of discipline and physical conditioning, meaning most elite fighters came from the upper classes, especially the knightly class who trained from childhood and carried the prestige of noble birth. But the crossbow didn't care about that. With only minimal training, a common foot soldier or a town militiaman could kill a knight from a safe distance with surprising accuracy. This upset the social balance on the battlefield in a way that few weapons had before. The military effectiveness of the crossbow was clear. It offered tremendous force with relatively little effort. A soldier didn't need the upper body strength of an archer or the close-range skill of a swordsman. He only had to load, aim, and pull the trigger. The bolt traveled fast and could penetrate mail armor with ease. In some cases, it even caused damage through early plate armor. That meant heavily armored cavalrymen, often the pride of medieval armies, were suddenly much more vulnerable than before. Their traditional advantage in both protection and training was under threat, and that made many ruling elites feel uneasy. The weapon didn't just break through armor, it broke through social boundaries that had defined warfare for centuries. It wasn't long before the church weighed in. The power of the crossbow became a moral concern, not just a tactical one. Religious leaders issued formal bans on its use against fellow Christians, framing the weapon as something cruel and unjust. The logic wasn't based on the brutality of the weapon in a physical sense. It was about how easily it allowed someone to kill from a distance, without risking their own life. In the eyes of religious authorities and many nobles, this made war less honorable, less about bravery, and more about cold efficiency. These concerns didn't completely stop the use of crossbows in battle, but they created a lasting perception that crossbows were somehow unfair or dishonorable. This reputation stuck. While crossbows continued to play a role in many conflicts, particularly in sieges and among certain city militias, they were often viewed with suspicion by traditional military leaders. Their presence on the battlefield reminded people that social rank and martial tradition could be shattered by a single pull of a trigger. That made them revolutionary, but also deeply controversial in a world where power, status, and warfare were tightly connected. Number 2, the reload problem and evolving battlefields. One of the major weaknesses of the crossbow became more noticeable as military tactics evolved and battles turned faster and more unpredictable. Early on, the weapon had an edge in power and ease of use, but as battlefield dynamics began to shift, so did the demands placed on soldiers. By the high and late Middle Ages, armies were no longer made up entirely of small groups of elite fighters engaging in rigid, set-piece confrontations. Larger forces with mixed infantry and cavalry units began to move in more coordinated and flexible ways, often relying on sudden charges, quick flanking actions, and faster engagements that required immediate response and adaptability from every unit involved. In this new environment, the crossbow's slow rate of fire became a serious tactical drawback. Reloading a standard crossbow wasn't a simple matter. It involved a mechanical process, often requiring the use of both hands, sometimes a foot stirrup or a crank mechanism, and usually took at least 15 to 20 seconds under ideal conditions. On a battlefield where momentum could shift in seconds, that kind of delay left the crossbowman exposed and unproductive. If the enemy advanced quickly or shifted direction, soldiers armed with crossbows could easily find themselves reloading instead of firing, unable to react in time to defend their position or support their unit effectively. To mitigate this problem, some armies introduced large portable shields called paved, which were placed in front of the crossbowmen to protect them while they reloaded. While this provided some cover, it also created limitations. The need to stay close to a fixed shield made these troops far less mobile, reducing their ability to reposition or retreat quickly. It also meant additional logistics, as someone had to carry and deploy these heavy shields during marches and combat. Over time, this approach began to feel outdated, especially as other ranged units like skilled archers or later early firearm users offered more sustained rates of fire without needing such defensive setups. As battle tactics emphasized speed, adaptability, and coordination, weapons that could be fired repeatedly without mechanical delay started to take precedence. Commanders needed units that could maintain pressure on the enemy without long pauses between attacks. Crossbows, powerful but slow, started to fall behind in terms of battlefield practicality. Even though they remained deadly in the right situations, their slow reload time simply didn't match the fast-changing pace of late medieval warfare. In many cases, soldiers with lighter, quicker weapons proved more useful in open battles where timing often mattered more than sheer force. Number 3. Armor races and weapon fatigue. As warfare developed and armor became more advanced, the crossbow faced a serious challenge that steadily undermined its battlefield value. In the early stages of its use, the crossbow had a clear advantage. It could pierce mail armor and inflict serious damage even against well-equipped opponents. However, over time, defensive technologies didn't remain static. Blacksmiths and armorers continued to improve their designs, producing stronger, more resilient forms of protection. Plate armor, once rare and basic, evolved into carefully engineered suits made from hardened steel that offered better coverage and more effective deflection against projectiles. This advancement created a kind of arms race, where improvements in one area forced innovations in the other. To keep up, crossbow makers started reinforcing the weapon's structure. Traditional wooden prods were replaced with steel ones, which could store more energy and deliver more force. But increasing the power of a crossbow wasn't as simple as just making it stronger. Greater force required more resistance, which in turn made drawing the string back a serious task. Cranks, windlasses, and other loading mechanisms became necessary, and although they worked, they drastically slowed down the reload process. What was once a weapon known for combining ease of use with deadly force turned into a cumbersome and complex machine that took far too long to operate in the heat of battle. The heavier crossbows could sometimes take nearly a full minute to reload, depending on the model and mechanism used. While this made sense in siege conditions, where defenders had time and cover to work with, it was impractical for open combat. A soldier who needed a full minute just to prepare the next shot couldn't keep pace with a fight that changed by the second. Mobility, flexibility, and sustained action were becoming more important than raw penetrating power, especially when more enemies were fighting in formation, moving rapidly and exploiting gaps as soon as they appeared. These slower crossbows also forced the user to stay in one place for extended periods, often behind cover or under protection. That limited their ability to reposition or adapt to a new threat quickly. In a fast-moving battle, those seconds spent cranking back a steel string were enough to turn an asset into a liability. The weight of the weapon, the gear needed to operate it, and the support required to protect its user all added up. Over time, commanders began to prefer alternatives that didn't rely so heavily on preparation or external support. The crossbow, once an equalizer, became increasingly outdated in the face of evolving armor and shifting battlefield demands. Number 4. Gunpowder changes everything. The arrival of gunpowder weapons marked a major turning point in the history of warfare, and directly impacted the future of the crossbow. Early firearms were far from perfect. They were heavy, unpredictable, and often just as dangerous to the person firing them as to the target. But despite all of that, they offered something that older projectile weapons, including crossbows, simply couldn't compete with in the long run. They introduced a completely different kind of power, one that didn't rely on muscle, mechanics, or careful craftsmanship in the same way traditional weapons did. Even in their crude form, early hand cannons were capable of producing loud, destructive blasts that could shock enemies,